The story that Bernice tells juxtaposes her mother's story with that of Hugh Llewellyn Glyn Hughes, the military leader responsible for leading rescue efforts at Bergen-Belsen. And from what we understand about the book, the reader will learn not only what Hughes brought to the ineffable situation, but also about his humanitarian stance towards the other, and how poignant that is for us to learn the importance of empathy for the other at this time where globally we are challenged with so many conflicts and issues and people struggling to find the way to reach to people who are different from us, people who are not the same, and how we at the Holocaust centers in Cape Town, Johannesburg, and Durban are inspired every day to have the opportunity to contact and make contact with 14 and 15 and 16-year-olds to help them to understand that each one of us every day is offered the choice on how we treat one another. And we hope that we inspire these young people to make positive choices. And so we'll learn in this book. And just to say that the book is available on Kindle. It's also an audio book. Sadly, it's not in hard copy available in South Africa yet, but by all means, download it on audio. I know how much I enjoy listening to audio on our walks. So the opportunity to hear the book is available on audio through Amazon for your Kindle, and certainly to have this presentation this evening, where we will hear the extraordinary story of a British doctor, a young Jewish girl, as I say, Bernice's mother. And as we look forward to that very much. Just want to say two things about Bernice. She was born in New York. She's the daughter, as I said, of Sydney and Ruth Mermelstein. She has 3 children, and she's the former Dean of Adult Learning at the Hebrew College and currently the Senior Scholar at Boston University Center for Character and Social Responsibility. We're thrilled to have you, Bernice, and I'm sure everybody sit back and relax and then look forward to a treat.
Thank you so much, Mary, for that kind introduction, and thank you so much. It's really an honor to be addressing the Durban and Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Centers. It's really exciting to be halfway around the world today. I'm going to now share with you some slides, a slide presentation. So let's see. Okay, this is the story of the book that I recently published. It's in the left side, you see the cover of the US version, the US publisher, All the Horrors of War. And on the right, you see the cover of the UK version. It's always a little bit interesting to see what publishers, how they conceive of the cover. Here, these publishers, the same text inside the books and same images, but I just want to show you the UK cover here on the right. This is my mom, who's fully standing, and here she is. She's not exactly in the setting they have her on the cover. You can see she's been nourished, and her wounds have more or less healed, except for internally. She's very sick with tuberculosis in this picture, and she is in a sanatorium in snowy northwest Sweden in Arvika. And here above you see a picture of Glen Hughes, who was the person who spearheaded the liberation of the largest Nazi concentration camp in Europe 3 weeks before the end of the war. And this is Glen Hughes. And I came to him because I was very curious about the actual mechanics of how my mom survived, what really happened when the Allied soldiers came into Bergen-Belsen. And he was very prominently associated with the liberation, and I basically fell in love with him. If you know the story of Oskar Schindler, he's sort of that type of figure, in that he really just embraced his role as liberator, saw the stranger, this strange emaciated person, not again as the other, but as a human being deserving of care. And he was very compassionate. So I set out to write a biography of him. So along the way, I also decided to write about my mom. I had stayed away from that for a long time, but people kept asking me about her. So how was I going to structure this story of these two disparate lives and really tell about Glyn Hughes, the liberator, and my mom, a child survivor? And finally, I came up with the idea with my editor of really telling it as a race against time story. These two protagonists represent a vast other group of people, my mom, the victims, Glen Hughes, the liberator. And so where were they during the various seasons of the last month of the war, during the months of the war, which is where a lot of the drama takes place. So the meat of the book tells about 4 seasons from the spring of 1944 to finally the 5th season, the spring of 1945, where they converge in Northwest Germany in this hell. And the prologue and epilogue give me an opportunity to tell some other really critical stories. And then I also sandwiched the book in between just a few pages of the Belsen trial to frame it. And it's important because Glen Hughes was the first witness at the Belsen trial, which is not as famous as the Nuremberg trials, which it immediately preceded, but it was the first trial to apply international law to war crimes in Nazi Germany. And here you see on the right an image from the makeshift courtroom in Lüneburg, Germany, in a gymnasium. And here are all the defendants. And Glen Hughes was the first witness. He stood at attention for 3 days during this trial. And here on the bottom right, you see a close-up of the defendants, and probably the most famous one next to Joseph Kramer, who was the head of the camp, was Irma Gracie, who was sort of a standout for her beauty. She was only 22 years old when she was hung. She was very cruel and sadistic. So I just want to mention, being there speaking with you, just sort of a South African connection before I talk a little bit about the book and the journey of the protagonists. And that is that Glen Hughes, it all started really in Ventersburg, South Africa, where Glen Hughes was born in 1892. And I don't know what Ventersburg is like today. Maybe someone can tell me in the chat or later. But then it was this real backwater, really small, maybe 17,000 people lived there. And it was like 11 miles to the nearest train station at a farm. And that is where his father, who was a doctor, Hugh Griffin Hughes, came to build his little corner of the British Empire and work there. And sadly, he died after being there just 2 years in serving a patient. He pricked himself with a needle and died 2 days later of septicemia. And Glen Hughes and his mom came back to England. He was just really little. He was only 2 years old. But later in life, Glen Hughes was a major athlete, and he played a lot of rugby football and with international teams. And he came back to visit Ventersburg and got really a great reception from the people living there, and heard such wonderful things about his dad and visited his dad's grave. So the story of the book. So for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to really focus on the point of convergence here in Bergen-Belsen. But I'll just tell you a couple of things about the journey, such as where the Glen Hughes started out in the Yorkshire Wolds, where my mom started out in Siget. And I'll tell you just one other interesting fact about D-Day, the D-Day landing on June 6, 1944, when the Allies landed on the shores of Normandy, and my mom was already in Auschwitz. But this was roughly the journeys that these protagonists took. So the Yorkshire Wolds was where the British practiced. Glen Hughes was at that point in charge of the Army's 8th Corps, and they were practicing setting up and taking down regimental aid posts and everything that was needed would be needed for the rescue of the wounded and and casualties on when they were fighting, and it resembled the Normandy topography. So that is why they were practicing there. Of course, the people who fought were later sort of shocked by the hedgerows and the difficulty in fighting in that terrain. My mom was from Siget, was probably still the most charming town in the Maramuresh region of Romania. And that's where she was born. At the time of the war, here's Siget, the whole area was taken over by Hungary. But this is, first of all, I don't have any photographs of my mom or anyone in her family from before the war, which is one of our great sadnesses. But I mean, she was lucky to survive. She was one of a family of about 30 people with cousins and aunts and uncles. And I tell some of what happened to them all in the book. But in the spring of 1944, it was Passover time, and she was sitting at the Seder table with her family. There were 9 people around the table. Never would she have imagined that 1 year later, only she and her older sister would survive. Everyone else would be murdered. But it was, given that I don't have any photographs, I thought I'd just show you a little bit about the town, because it was just so charming and beautiful. And I did go back there to visit. And though this is from a long time ago, everything's built like around this time, this square in the middle of town. It was a beautiful place for a young girl to sort of be a free range kid and roam around. And she lived somewhere over here, and Elie Wiesel lived somewhere over here, if you know him. And I had my mom once, I just could plumb her memory. So she did draw where her apartment was, our apartment here, in between this alleyway from what was Kigya Utsa and Timar Utsa, the Jewish street, and Kigya Utsa was the street called Snake Street, and it was where they lined up the Jews when they deported them to the trains, when they rounded them up and took them to the train station. And when I was there, this was all that was left of it, if you could just sort of see the distance of that alleyway. So that was where she was from. So June 6, 1944, when the great, magnificent armada of multinational force landed on the shores of Normandy and fighting on the beaches there, I shouldn't say only, there were half the number of Allied soldiers were killed on June 6th as people were murdered in Auschwitz on June 6th, which is outstanding statistic. So twice as many people were murdered in Auschwitz on June 6th as Allied soldiers were killed on the beaches of Normandy. Moreover, every day after that, the casualties numbers decreased in the fighting, although it was very difficult and horrible. And every day after that, the number remained the same at Auschwitz. The number of people gassed and burned every day in Auschwitz remained the same for at least a month. And I'm going to be showing you some images, and I'm sort of trembling as I show you the ones of Bergen-Belsen, because these were real human beings. I don't have their permission to show these images, but there is a reason they were documented, and that is really for people to know what happened. And nothing could be as bad as what was shown. But as you look at some of these photos, I'm just going to ask you to think about what was going on, what the photographer was trying to capture in taking these, and then what is really happening on a micro level behind the scenes. So here you could see the great organization of Auschwitz separating the men and the women, and you could see a woman turning to a small child and talking to her. And you could see the talking, and you could, if you did like, if you zoomed in, you could probably see a lot more details of what's happening in these photos. And before I get to that, I'm just going to, I just want to tell you that in the archives, I found really thousands of Glen Hughes's notes and pages. And I just was very captivated by his handwriting and his, I'm an amateur graphologist, so I could just tell you the generosity in extending a hand in the letter, in the way he wrote. And I want to show you these pictures just to show you how the calculations went. Here's D-Day, D+1, D+2, D+3, estimating the number of casualties on the beaches and the evacuating them, and the types of units that were needed to serve the men. Great medical care for the British soldiers, and the general hospitals, how many beds each had. And this was a very meticulous medical organizer. Glen Hughes was promoted during the war to Deputy Director of Medical Services for the entire British Second Army. He was a very talented, detail-oriented person. And I'm telling you this because when he came into Bergen-Belsen, he was totally unprepared. It was a great shock. Everything was about preparedness, getting ready, knowing what to expect roughly, but this was nothing like anything he had ever seen. So in my book, I describe how it came to be that the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp was handed over to the Allies 3 weeks before the end of World War II, which was on May 8th. And it was an extraordinary story in itself, because Hitler had meant for no inmate to be turned over alive. And there were a lot of rumors about what was happening, and there were real things that were happening in other camps where inmates were all killed and the camps were not turned over. But Bergen-Belsen was turned over. And part of the agreement was, of course, danger typhus signs were erected everywhere, and the camp was rife with typhus. And there was a great fear of the inmates breaking out, whoever was still healthy enough, breaking out of the camp and spreading typhus into the countryside. So it had to still be contained. And there were different parts of Bergen-Belsen. There was Camp 1, Camp 2. Camp 1 was the horror camp. It had 41,000 people in it. Camp 2 had about another 20,000. And Camp 1 people were really in terrible shape. There were 3 compounds on one side, 2 on the other. My mom was in one of them. The 5 or 6 days before the handover, people were given no food and no water. Before that, they barely had a few calories a day. Like, it was very minimal. And so you had a real hell. It was a very different type of hell from Auschwitz, which was also unspeakable. But here was, they didn't have gas chambers and crematoria. So people were just dying of emaciation and disease. There were at least 3 epidemics raging throughout the camp: typhus, tuberculosis, and gastroenteritis. It was a terrible, terrible situation. So I'm just going to show you some images. So here, just to let you know, on this pathway, rocky and muddy, the inmates who still had strength in them were forced to sort of clean up the camp before the Allied forces came. And my mom was one of them. And I can remember very vividly, like it was yesterday, the evening in our laundry room in our home. When I was growing up, I must have been 15 years old, when she demonstrated for me. I used to watch her while she was ironing, and she put down the iron and she showed me how she, who she said was 50% dead, had to drag people who were skeletal to a mass grave. And some of them, she said, were just 90% dead. They still had breath in them. And she leaned forward, stretched her arms out behind her, bent her knees, and showed me how she had to do that kind of work. And when she was telling me these stories, this was before the word Holocaust was even really in modern parlance. It was just, she was just telling me about what she had gone through during the war. So when the British came in, obviously the inmates who were so deathly ill couldn't continue that work that they were pressed into. They were dying on the job. So there were corpses littered all over Bergen-Belsen at the time of the liberation, and mounds of it. And it was really shocking to the liberators. Every account was just, I mean, the British soldiers were vomiting and sick, and the photographers who had to do this work were just, their heads were exploding. It was a very macabre, horrible scene. And so they came in, they were enraged, and there was about 80 SS officers who remained in the camp for the transfer, and they were pressed into service, into taking the corpses, cleaning them, loading them onto trucks. And here in the background of this picture, you can see those inmates who were healthy enough, because there were some who were more recent arrivals to Bergen-Belsen who were still in good form, and or from wherever they came, and they were like jeering at the SS. Yeah, the majority of the people who were still okay at liberation, they had come just to Bergen-Belsen just about 5 days before. It was still terrible, but my mom had been there for already a month, and she arrived, I calculate, probably within a week or two of when Anne Frank died there. And that was the norm. Death was the norm. And the mass graves had to be dug out, and more of them had to be dug. And here you see it was about 12 feet deep, 20 to 30 feet wide, 40 to 50 feet long. And here you see Rabbi Leslie Hardman. And he was the British chaplain who came in with the British Second Army. And he is just bereft at the way people are buried, just so upset by how it had to be done. And here on the upper right, you see a girl, it could have been my mother, it wasn't her though, but you see a square cut out of the back of her coat. And I just wanted to sort of point that out. There were ways of identifying people lest they try to escape on the death march on the way to the camp. They had their coats, in this case, the coats had a square cut out of the back of them. And yeah, there's a lot to this, but that happened, of course, to my mom's coat. And they didn't know, here's a marker of a grave once it was filled in. And actually, honestly, they did not know how many people were buried in each grave. This is all, as Glen Hughes would tell the Second Army higher-ups, guesswork. So here are some more scenes of sort of the squalor in the camp and the situation. Here on the right, you see some women who are well enough, and what they were inured to. People in the background were just, just the corpses laying everywhere. They were used to the stench. They were used to the sights. And I describe in my book how it took Glen Hughes, took the British several days to really get organized. They were, as I said, they were totally unprepared. They had units fighting all around Northwest Germany. Battles were still raging. How were they going to cope with this humanitarian situation, calling for humanitarian aid? And they left Hungarian soldiers in charge. There were Hungarian soldiers working in the camp, guards, and the first few days, and it was terrible. And because they would sit in their watchtowers shooting at inmates who ran to get potatoes from where they knew there were mounds of potatoes. And my mom was one of them. And I describe how one of her people from her hometown was shot, and she scavenged for potatoes and then they tried to somehow cook them. And the distance, if you've noticed, from the tents to the huts is pretty significant in my book. The third day after the liberation, the British Lightfield ambulance pitched a dump of tentage right near the huts to try to get people out of the huts who were well enough so that they could get inside and maybe get a sip of water to someone who could not move. So those who were still ambulatory were asked to move into these tents. And there's a big story about my mom sort of going into a tent with 4 others and and then being expelled from the tent, having to crawl back to the hut, and then being beaten up there. So after the liberation, I think that's what I really tried to show in my book, sort of what happens on the ground. That's really astounding. It's not like the British come in, the sun is shining, the sky is blue, people are liberated, people are free. This was a long and complicated process of liberation. And the way they had to sort of triage and rescue people was to do it en masse, with the British soldiers going into the huts and evacuating them one by one. A medic would go in and mark someone's forehead with an X if they thought they had a chance of surviving, if they still had some breath in them and they weren't too far gone and emaciated. And then men of the light field ambulance, you could see in their protective equipment, would go in and pick those people out. And again, a lot went on behind the scenes. I've read a lot of accounts of like, my aunt picking up a piece of chalk. By the way, some of my aunts were also there, and my father's sisters and sister-in-law, and marking their forehead themselves or rubbing their forehead against someone who was marked so that they would be picked to go in the ambulance. And these were called contaminated ambulances because the people still had the typhus germ on them. And after they were taken to the human laundry, which was a cavalry stables about 1.5 miles away, they then went in clean ambulances to makeshift hospital rooms. And the human laundry had about 60 tables set up, and they had to use German nurses, mostly from the countryside, from nearby hospitals, because that's all they could get. They were really short on person power, and that freaked out some of the inmates being handled by Germans, but they were supervised by British Army personnel, and they had to wash the inmates, spray them with DDT, and wrap them in a clean blanket and take them in a clean ambulance. And if you could just begin to think about the logistics of this, like where are they going to get 60,000 or, clean blankets from? So here's some approximate numbers. I'm just going to read this from the bottom. There were 14,000 patients ultimately in the Glen Hughes hospital, which was really like a complex. There was the main hospital, and there were other like Wehrmacht officer buildings in a square that were used. Anyway, it was the largest such facility in Europe and maybe anywhere ever. And there were 14,000 patients on May 19th, 1945. And yes, the inmates named the hospital for Glen Hughes. That's how important he was to them. That's how he stood out among everyone there, to the survivors who worked with him, who helped with the rescue, whoever had any medical background at all helped with and was well enough helped with the rescue. It took 2 weeks for the backlog of corpses to be buried. 500 former inmates died each day for 1 month after the liberation. There were only 361 British Army soldiers and medical personnel in the relief of Bergen-Belsen 2 days later, after the liberation. 750 to 1,000 sick were processed each day for over 3 weeks after the liberation at the human laundry. And I calculated that my mom was probably taken to the human laundry on the first or second day it was up and running, which took about a week. There were 25,000 fit, able to walk, Belsen survivors who were transferred, who suffered from various stages of emaciation, who were transferred to the formerly Wehrmacht Transit and Rehabilitation Barracks. And able to walk, the test was, could you walk up 3 steps to get into a truck? And so there were people who then fell sick, and they were sort of back and forth between the hospital area and the DP camp. It was really complicated. And 55 to 60,000 sick and dying prisoners were found in Bergen-Belsen at the time of its liberation. 2/3 were women, 1/3 men, 400 to 500 were children. And what you have to realize that these prisoners, This was happening, by the way, at other concentration camps in Germany that the Allies were coming upon, right? In Flossenburg and Dachau and other places. This was the largest and the largest number, and it was deep in Germany. And these sick and dying had been the strongest, right? These were the people who were strong, had worked for the Nazi war effort. They had evaded the gas chambers in Auschwitz, and then they had survived the death march, and here they were. So on May 21st, finally, when the last hut was evacuated, and after each hut was evacuated, it had to be burned down because of the typhus, there was a ceremony where there was the raising of the Union Jack, the British flag, and they burned down the last hut with an effigy of Hitler on it and the Iron Cross flag. And here's a sign. This is the main Glen Hughes Hospital building, a sign to it. Here's Glen Hughes here. He gave the order for the building, the last hut, to be torched. He did not want to raise the Union Jack, not on May 8th and Victory in Europe Day, not until Bergen-Belsen was completely cleaned up. And here you see soldiers and some surviving inmates coming to witness the ceremony. And it was really significant. This small country off the coast near Sri Lanka is the Maldives. On the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II, they issued these stamps. And one of them was of the burning of the last hut in Bergen-Belsen. And here you see the actual photo and the stamp. So I did this little statistical analysis. So there was about 13,000 people deported from Siget. That was included all the townspeople and people from the surrounding villages in the spring of 1944 to Auschwitz. And 174 people wound up going from Bergen-Belsen at the end of the war to Sweden. Now, there were people from Siget. 90% were probably killed in Auschwitz. The other people probably, they were taken all different workplaces. Not everybody wound up in Bergen-Belsen. Some of the Siget survivors then died along the way if they survived Auschwitz. And certainly there might have been some Siget survivors in Bergen-Belsen who did not go to Sweden. They maybe tried to go home. Sweden took in about 7,000 of the sickest survivors from Bergen-Belsen, aiming to rehabilitate them and get them on their feet, hoping that they would be repatriated or go somewhere after about 6 months. My mom was in Sweden for 10 years in and out of TB sanatoriums. Anyway, so I did a breakdown of the ages because it's a little bit of an indicator of who actually had a chance of surviving Hitler's scourge. So you see very few people in their 50s, some people in their 40s, not too many, some in their 30s. Most of the people who survived were in their 20s. They had the best chance of surviving, of working for the Nazi war effort and being strong enough. And my mom was born in 1929. She was 15 at the time of the liberation. Her sister was born in 1928, and there were just a few who were younger than them. So here's the first picture I have of my mom. It's this group picture that I blew up because for earliest picture of her ever, and she is in a makeshift hospital in Katrineholm, Sweden, and you could see she's still quite bruised and has this vacant look in her eyes. And these are all young girl survivors, and this is the medical team taking care of them. And this woman, Dr. Leffler, saved my mom's life. It was the first time my mom had personalized medical attention, and yeah, she always talked about her. And just fast forward, just going to the epilogue, just a couple of things. Here's Glen Hughes at the time of the liberation, and you could sort of see the very serious expression in his eyes of what the weight of his responsibility. He actually broke down crying. He was such a strong military man, did such courageous things in World War I and World War II, had seen all the horrors of war, which is what he said at the Belsen trial. I have seen all the horrors of war, but nothing to touch Bergen-Belsen. here he is after. He's a great sportsman. In an epilogue, I talk about some of the things that he did that that I think reflect the type of human being he was, and how he really was great humanitarian, and his connection with the Jewish people after the war, and by extension, the state of Israel. And here's my mom after the war with her sister. And here they are in their early 20s. You could see they're young ladies in there in Sweden. My mom meets my dad, who's also a survivor. Here he is in a DP camp on the right, and they get married. And here she is today, and she speaks to groups all over the world. So if I have time, do I have a few more minutes just to show a little bit of the aftermath in Bergen-Belsen, the displaced persons camp?
Yes, you've got plenty of time.
Okay, so while mourning incalculable losses, survivors, nearly all of whom had lost most of their relatives, formed a vibrant displaced persons community. Now, this was not a chapter my mom was part of, because my mom went to Sweden in July of 1945, just a few months after the liberation. But there was a group of people who came to Bergen-Belsen, who stayed in Bergen-Belsen, who were well enough. And people from all over Europe were coming to Bergen-Belsen to see if anyone they knew had survived. And there were probably about 12,000 people in this DP camp. And it's an extraordinary story in human history. So the devout and the secular, people who came from all kinds of backgrounds, those who had lost faith and those who held fast to Jewish precepts, united around a common goal: to create a meaningful narrative of their sufferings by turning their sights to a Jewish homeland and to a future in which they could live normal lives. And this is quite remarkable. You had among the survivors some people who were leaders in Jewish youth groups before the war, and they knew how to organize. And one of them was this man, Jossel Rosensaft, who managed to survive, who was sort of small in stature physically, but a giant of a man, and some other leaders. And they started to organize these forlorn, displaced persons who had to start from scratch, who did not want to be repatriated. Where were they going to go? Where? To their homes? There was nobody there for them. And especially those from Eastern Europe. So he organized them around the goal of making their new lives in Palestine. And here you have soldiers from the British Brigade who were from Palestine, who fought actually the Nazis. And they came, they were so impressive, and rallies around Palestine. And it was a very political hotbed to get into, because the British had no interest in these DPs going to Palestine. And so I talk about that in the book, and about Glen Hughes' part in all that. They also had in the displaced persons community theater. You had very talented people who survived, who were actors, and they wrote plays, and some of the plays reflected their immediate past experiences of being ghettoized, and here are the actors wearing those prison uniforms, and you had audiences of thousands of people crying throughout these performances. They also in the DP camp had training for people so that they could be skilled workers after the war and bring skills to the land of their future land of Israel. And this was through the Organization for Rehabilitation and Training, ORT. And you also had very complex situations, because you had these young people, most of the survivors were in their 20s and 30s, right? And some of them had been married, and what happened to their spouse? And how were the rabbis going to deal with this Talmudic question of people looking so quickly to couple, to rebuild? And yet, what happens if somehow a spouse that they supposed had died surfaced at some later point? So 420 men and 300 women who had been married and did not know the fates of their spouses were granted permission to remarry, with a caveat built into the Bergen-Belsen ketubah marriage document, that saying that if a former spouse survived, they were entitled to some assets that might have been accumulated. There were going to be some provisions for them. So following all these marriages, like so many weddings, people having this urge to build their families anew, was the largest baby boom in history, so far surpassing that of the German women in the countryside. People in the Bergen-Belsen DP camp were having babies. It was just an extraordinary phenomenon. And in the years after the war, 2,000 babies were born to survivors in the Glen Hughes hospital. So you have these 2,000 people now walking this earth. Hopefully most of them are still alive. They're in their 70s now, or maybe even early 80s, no, 70s, they're in their 70s. And they were born in the Glen Hughes hospital. So you could see all the things that were set up for babies and all the things that babies need, they had in the GON and the kindergarten. It was just like an amazing thing that happened. It was just incredible. So here I'm going to show now a film by Rabbi Zvi Azaria Herman Helfgott speaking. And he was a rabbi from Yugoslavia. He was in Yugoslavian POW camps during the war. He quickly came to Bergen-Belsen after the war. And here he came to help, and he stayed there for a number of years. And here he tells of an incident. I'm going to start it from the beginning.
מבלוק לבלוק, לראות מי נפטר, להוציא אותם ולקבור אותם. אבל מה? הייתה פקודה מאנגלים, שאי אפשר קבר אחים לעשות בגלל המחלות, אלא קבר אחים. קבר אחים. כולם יחד. כלומר, שורה אחת, נגיד 20-30, על זה כן סיד, כן, ועל זה שוב כן איזה 30-20 וזה, כמו שהיה במחנה המוות הזה, איפה שאלפים. אבל יום אחד ניגשה אליי אישה ואמרה לי, רבי, שמעתי היום שבבלוק הזה וזה, ביתי נפטרה. אז אמרתי, אז מה לעשות? אני רוצה קבר בשבילה, קבר יחיד. אמרתי, אבל זה בלתי אפשרי. אבל לכן אני מבקשת ממך. אז אמרתי לה, את יודעת מה? בלילה כשחיילים בדרך כלל האנגלים נמצאים במועדונים, אז אנחנו נקבור אותם. אנחנו נביא את הגופה, ואנחנו כן נקבור אותם. ובאמת, בלילה היא קמה מהמיטה, ואני ניסיתי מהר לקבור אותה, קדיש להגיד, ופתאום כשאני רציתי כבר סתום את הגולל, היא אומרת לי, רגע אחד רבי. והיא פנתה עם העיניים לשמיים ואמרה, ריבונו של עולם, ביידיש, אני מודה לך לזכות הגדולה, שנתת לי היום לקבור את ביתי במו ידיים. אמן. מרגע זה, אני מוכרח להגיד, נעשיתי אדם אחר. עשינו עכשיו את הכל על מנת לעזור לאנשים, בדרך לחיים. ופה התחלנו לאשכול לדאוג, היו כמה ילדים לגן ילדים, ואחר כך להקים בית ספר, כן. פה עזרו לנו הרבה אנשי בריגדה שהגיעו כבר בזמן הזה, כן, לברגן-בלסן גם כן. והקמנו כבר גם כן תיאטרון, כן. חיים חדשים התחילו, כן. ופה אני עסקתי עד 48, כן. פה בתורה, חתונות התחילו, כן. ברית מילות, כן, וכו'. ואני לא צריך להדגיש כמה שאני הייתי מאושר. כל משפחה רצתה שבברית מילה שאני נתת לכולם חופה וקידושים שאני אחזיק את הילד. היום המאושר ביותר בחיים שלי היה בילד האלף, כשאני החזקתי בידיי. הילד האלף. אני עברתי.
So that's my presentation. This was a sign that was erected at the Bergen-Belsen camp. It's no longer there, but now finally they have a very good museum there if you ever are in the neighborhood, and shows a lot more of the pictures and the life after in the DP camp. But the British were so angry and they were sarcastic here, and so they said 10,000 unburied dead were found here. Another 13,000 have since died, all of them victims of the German New Order in Europe and an example of Nazi culture. So if you have any questions now for the chat, I'm happy to answer them. And if a question occurs to you later, you can always contact me also through my website. So I'm going to stop the screen share now.
Thank you, Bernice. Thank you so much for that just so informative and really powerful presentation. And I'll just invite everyone once again, if you have any questions, to put those in the chat now. We do have a question in the chat from Michael. He's asking, could you explain a bit more about how Sweden decided to take in DPs, given that Sweden was part sympathetic to Germany during the war?
So that's a great question. And maybe it's in part maybe answered because they were in part sympathetic to Germany during the war. Maybe they were trying in some fashion to make amends, or really, realizing what happened. And I'm not sure I can fully answer that, but that's part of the reason, I think. And they were close enough, and there were people in Sweden who were working. There was even the reason the camp was even turned over had to do with Himmler's masseuse, who was visiting with some Jewish emissaries, I think, from the World Jewish Congress in Sweden. So there were humanitarians and there were people lobbying for the survivors in Sweden. But I think part of the reason might have, I don't know if I would use the word guilt, but maybe that is the right word, that they decided to take in survivors and rehabilitate. And then there was Count Folk Bernadotte and Raoul Wallenberg, and there were people who were concerned.
Thank you. We have a question from Maureen, who's part of our Durban team, and she's asking, how were the survivors picked to go to Sweden, and how were they transported? Were those who recovered in the DP camp also taken to Sweden?
That big effort was like almost immediately in the aftermath. That was the summer of 1945 when people were taken to Sweden. When Sweden announced this, the Swedish Red Cross came to the camp, and they really went by who was the sickest, like who, a lot of people had TB and typhus, and they went by who was really too sick and couldn't, like my mom, couldn't make a decision about where she was going to be. She was really sick. And then they tried not to separate, like if you survived with a sister or a cousin, they tried not to separate families. So even if someone was a little healthier, they went with their relative. And that was it. They did do x-rays to check people's lungs. They gave them the option of going to Sweden. But a lot of people, they couldn't go home. They didn't know where to go. And so they did go to Sweden. The transport, it was really, they came to Sweden. They came to Bergen-Belsen. The Swedish Red Cross came, and I describe in my book the details, because the only real document I had of the actual procedure of how they took people, like some of them in stretchers, and to a train, and then took them to Lübeck, where they stayed for, I think, weeks even before the ships were ready. A number of ships were ready to bring them over to Sweden, was a document we uncovered at my aunt's house my aunt's apartment before she died. I couldn't find any. My aunt, one of my aunts was a survivor from Bergen-Belsen, and she had written letters to her brother, sort of keeping this journal, like writing, not even knowing if he survived, about detailing the experience. And that was the most detailed account I found of the actual, how they put people on stretchers, how they took them to the train, what they fed them in the train, what it was like in the port in Lubeck, waiting to go over to Sweden. And, you know, a lot of people being taken onto the boats on stretchers. And so that was how they did it. And then they got to Sweden. And then what was the process of processing these sick people, getting them clothing, taking them to a quarantine, shipping them out, farming them out to different makeshift hospitals all around the country and TB sanatoriums. And it's a big story, but it was a big logistical thing. And it was a masterfully done, I would say, by the Swedish government and their military and their Red Cross.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Somebody in the chat, G Home, is asking, well, it's just stating really that Canadian troops were instrumental in liberating the camp and dealing with the conditions. And maybe you could just speak to who else is involved in the liberation of Bergen-Belsen and the aftermath.
Yeah, there were Canadians who came, there was some Americans who came later. Glen Hughes corralled help from wherever he could get it. He had to bring in typhus experts on feeding the starved. Wherever in the world he could find the expertise and the help and the military acumen, he brought them in. I don't know, yeah, there's a big question about why more people couldn't be mobilized, even let's say doctors from different parts of the world. But all these humanitarian rescues, as we know, even from today, take time. Everything human takes time. So even when we had, like, you know, in the United States, this flood in New Orleans or wherever part of the country, it takes time to mobilize help and get people. But yes, the Canadian soldiers had a big role in the liberation of Bergen-Belsen.
Thank you. Luke is asking in the chat, why did the British soldiers allow Hungarian soldiers to shoot inmates in those first few days?
They didn't allow. It was just a habit. They didn't have enough person power, and they didn't see everything that was happening on the ground. If they witnessed any shooting, they would, you know, they would take that person and shoot them. Like the British were furious at what was going on, but they didn't see everything, and they didn't have enough people there those first few days.
G Home is asking again, any thoughts on Holocaust photography? I know we saw quite a few photographs in the beginning of your presentation. He's asking about the eye of the photographer and the perceptions of the viewers then and now.
So it's really important, right? It's part of the way that we receive story and understand story is through images. We know that now, like, you know that through the internet, through YouTube videos, through Instagram. I mean, you know, this is the way things are talked about and publicized. If we see an image, we may be closer, a little bit closer to understanding. And the British Film and Photographic Unit, when they first came into Bergen-Belsen, they knew what their charge was. Their charge was to document and show everything. And they really doubled down on that with their reporting and their taking it. Bergen-Belsen was the most filmed and photographed liberation that there was. In fact, sometimes when you see films like documentaries about the war and the liberation, they're always showing pictures of that were taken in Bergen-Belsen. So it was extremely important. It was very difficult for the photographers, really hard for them. And they weren't trained to take photographs of mass graves or people like this. So, but their professionalism kicked in, they did the job, and some of them vowed never again to take photographs. I mean, it was a very powerful, difficult experience for them.
Thank you. I've got a private message here asking, Where was your mum prior to Bergen-Belsen? Was she at any other camps before Bergen-Belsen?
Yes, she was taken to Auschwitz when she was first taken away with her family. And she was in Auschwitz for about 2 months. And then miraculously, she got out of there. She was chosen to work in a labor camp, and that was a miracle. And she was taken to a labor camp where she worked for about 6 months. And then she was on the death march, and then she landed in Bergen-Belsen.
And then just another question related to your mother. Michael is asking, and I'm very sorry, I'm going to not say the name correctly, but has your mum ever gone back to Sedge? I hope I'm saying it okay. Yes.
No, she never went back. She never went back. Me and my sister went back just before the pandemic, but she never went back.
Okay. And there are no more questions in the chat, so if anybody would like to add one at the last minute, please do. But I just wanted to say to those who are living in Durban, our Durban Holocaust and Genocide Centre has just had a bit of a refresher, and we've redone our section on liberation. And part of that was including a film that we created around liberation and around the liberation of Bergen-Belsen, because we have the testimony of a local Durbanite who is Rabbi Isaac Richards, who actually served, for those who are interested, the Durban Progressive Congregation for a long time. And he was stationed at Bergen-Belsen immediately after the liberation for 2 years. And so we based a little film around his testimony and the liberation of Bergen-Belsen. So I'd invite anyone in Durban to come and visit the museum to see those changes. But I just wanted to close off by asking you, Bernice, you've focused your book on 2 different stories, the story of your mum and the story of Glen Hughes, and just why sort of bring those personal stories into telling this larger narrative, and what do you hope people will take away from your book when they read it?
So I think that we can better understand history in the larger context if we do it through individual lives, right? We're all wired to hear story. And so I think having these compelling protagonists who are really in their own ways, each exemplars of courage and fortitude and compassion, adds to our repertoire of stories we can carry with us. And I think the more such stories we have, and the more such stories young people have, the better they are fortified for whatever comes in this life. And also, I'm hoping that people will also, just as Mary said, as we opened up, not see the other as a stranger, but as a fellow human being, deserving of our respect and our reverence, and really trying to understand the other and see the humanity in the human person, the other human person. And so that's what I'm hoping people come away with. Of course, I'm hoping they also gain a greater understanding of the enormity of the tragedy and some understanding for the history. But I'm hoping that if it changes or turns their soul a little bit, it sounds cliched, but makes them better in some way.
Thank you. Thank you, Bernice. And just on behalf of the Durban Holocaust and Genocide Centre and the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Centre, thank you for giving us your time today. And I, for one, have so enjoyed hearing about your book. And just for everybody, just a reminder that the book is available online. You can access it through Amazon, and details about that are also in the chat if you'd like to get a hold of Bernice Lerner's book. And we invite you to join us again. We would love to see you all again at one of our webinars in the near future. You can visit our websites for more information about that, or our social media. And that's all from us. So thank you very much again, Bernice. It's been such a pleasure having you with us.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. Thank you all for attending.
Thank you. Thank you again to the participants for your wonderful questions, and we look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you.